So if you go to page 11 in Matheson and Bade's presentation, you get table 2. Table 2. And table 2 in this presentation talks about the percentage of revenue that comes into the city from entertainment. And he'll say, for example, that in employment, he talks up with industry employees and employment in sort of entertainment, the arts, recreation, that in New Orleans, 4% of the people living in New Orleans are employed in what we would call entertainment and recreation, the arts. He then breaks that down and says that the performing arts and spectator sports account for 1% of total employees in New Orleans. And then finally, the total number of employees in New Orleans who are in spectator sports, such as the New Orleans Saints, is 0.62% of the employees in the city of New Orleans, right? So it's a very small percentage. He then goes on to talk about the annual industry payroll in New Orleans, and the annual industry payroll for the arts, for entertainment, recreation, is about 3.5% of those people employed in New Orleans, and that only 1% of those people actually work in spectator sports, such as those who would be employed by the Superdome. Then he says, if you look at New Orleans in general, for industry establishments, he calls it, the number of sort of industries involved in this, in spectator sports, it's only 2% of the industry in New Orleans is associated with spectator sport. So he says if you put all that together, that when it comes to employment activity, economic activity in New Orleans, that the arts, entertainment, and recreation industry, as he's putting it, is very small. It's very small for all cities, he says, so this isn't unusual. And that spectator sports element accounts for less than 1% by all measures, right? By all measures, where you're looking at the number of employees, where you're looking at annual payroll, where you're looking at the number of industry establishments, it's always less than 1% of New Orleans economic activity, right? So he says this isn't unusual, as we said earlier, that for most American cities, professional sports teams, professional sports venues really account for a small percentage of a city's economic activity and therefore economic growth. So he's a little concerned, both of these guys, Matheson and Bade, are a little concerned about the benefit in the long run versus the cost of investment to get the Superdome back up to where it needs to be. He also goes in to say, or they also go in to say, the cost of the sports infrastructure is really, one of the big problems, he says, is that there is not enough business risk, if you will, for such a venture, not enough risk for the owners of the business. These guys are very, what's the word I'm going to say, critical of the fact that the owners of the New Orleans Saints in particular expect the city of New Orleans to cover the cost of rebuilding the Superdome, but also expect the city of New Orleans to have some guarantees, if you will, some kind of tax rebates, other sort of income guarantees to make sure that the Saints are profitable to the owners of the Saints, because the city of New Orleans wants to keep this major NFL team. For example, the authors say that in 2005, the owner, Benson, of the Saints, risked $81 million in subsidies. Basically, the New Orleans people, the city of New Orleans, and also the state of Louisiana, will give subsidies on an annual basis of $81 million to the New Orleans Saints to sort of keep them there. And those subsidies could be tax breaks. Those subsidies could be security issues. It could be just something that the city is providing, if you will. It may not be outright cash, but it's something the city is providing to the team to enhance their stay, to get them to stay, right? So it could be tax breaks. It could be, say, security for when a Super Bowl is held at the Superdome, or who knows? It could be something to that effect, right? But also in 2005, Benson was offered $1 billion to move the Saints he was made an offer to take them out to Los Angeles, right? So what is in his interest to stay in New Orleans? Yes, he could save $81 million in subsidies from the city and the state to stay, right? But he's being offered $1 billion from Los Angeles to come. So he doesn't have the owner of the team, and that's not just one person. There's several, usually a group who owns this. The owners of the team have not a whole lot of incentive to stay in New Orleans. They don't have that kind of incentive economically, despite the fact that, at Matheson and Bade will say, that the New Orleans fans sold out the Superdome with the Saints there, 36 straight games, right? Still, the financial resources of New Orleans fans are limited. Because they're small in number, again, a small city. Also in New Orleans, Matheson and Bade are quick to point out, there are very few corporate sponsors available. There aren't as many great large corporations in New Orleans as there are in some other cities, say Chicago, Houston, Dallas. There aren't as many great corporations based in New Orleans who might strike up a relationship with the Saints or with the Superdome and try to, in their own way, subsidize this place, maybe by buying boxes or advertising, you name it. Right? The Superdome needed, after Katrina, and probably even before, $600 million for renovation. If you spread that over 30 years, Matheson and Bade says if you're going to pay that out over 30 years, if the city were to take that on, it would be 27% of the city's capital budget. So better than a quarter of the city's capital budget over 30 years for the $600 million. Now, of course, you all know that when you start to renovate a stadium like this, in 10 years, you're going to need to do it again, right? So this is a huge investment over a long period of time, eating up a huge percentage of the city's budget. So when you put that together, Matheson and Bade asked the question, why should the Saints stay in New Orleans? The existence of substantial subsidies for infrastructure undermines the team's commitment to the city. If they're not investing themselves in the Superdome, if they're not investing themselves in the city, why should they stay? They aren't going to lose anything by moving, right? What incentives can there possibly be? Ultimately, and you might see where this is going, Matheson and Bade argue against rebuilding the New Orleans Superdome. They say the cost associated with housing an event, things like, say the Super Bowl comes to New Orleans. The city owns that building. The city is responsible for the maintenance and the uptake of that building, right? And one of the things that often doesn't get included in the cost of running the building is when you have spectacular events come to the Superdome. The expenditures for extra security, as we mentioned, sometimes don't get passed on to the Superdome. Sometimes they're just maintained by, say, the police department. They just count that as part of their budget. And so they're really worried about that. The other thing they suggest is if we spent that money someplace else, if we didn't spend it on the Superdome, that's $600 million, maybe we could spend it on building a better levee system. It's a very pointed criticism. Made me go, ouch, when I read it. Yeah. So they are very critical of the fact that the city would rather spend money on the Superdome when it has very limited return on investment, whereas a better levee system would have a better return on investment as regards preventing flooding in the future. The money spent by a single household on, say, a spectacular sporting event at the Dome often precludes them spending that money elsewhere in the community. Professional sports may actually reduce the total spending in a local community. We may have a net outflow of money, they're suggesting. I don't know about you, but it's been a while since I've been, say, to the Kansas City Royals or the Dallas Cowboys. But the last time I got to see a major NFL game, it was in Arizona. I think we paid upwards of $300 for the tickets. We were in the nosebleed section, and parking was expensive. I don't think we bought food because I think we were so high up we didn't want to go to the concession stand. But it was just three of us, and I think we probably spent just $300 there. If we had taken the family, if we'd taken a few kids, we probably would have spent $1,000, right? Getting there, parking, tickets, food. In this case, we actually spent the night at a hotel, so easily you could spend a lot of money. And according to Matheson and Bade, they're concerned that a lot of that money goes straight to the Saints organization. Maybe some of it will go to the Superdome, but then that money, because a lot of the people who play for the Saints, a lot of the people who manage, coach, own the Saints, don't really make New Orleans their home. And so they don't, in turn, then take that money and put it back into the community, back into the economy. So the argument here is that middle class and lower class fans of the Saints will go and spend $100, $200 a person to go see the game, but a small fraction of that money stays in the community. And in fact, if they had used that money to go to a local concert, if they had used that money to go to minor league baseball games, say, that money would have stayed in the community as opposed to going into this mega NFL machine where the players are spread all over the country and maybe the money doesn't come back, right? That's a suggestion. I don't know if they have the data to support that well. He says, value created in a community from sports may not be value that a community recognizes in the way of increased incomes, which are spent again in the community. So there may be value to professional sports, absolutely, but it may not be a dollar value. It may not be an economic value that comes back to the community as we were talking. He says he kind of likens it to when the circus comes to town. So the circus comes to town, the circus comes put on a great show, you see them, and they go away, and they don't come back again until next year. They take all of their people with them, they take all of their revenue with them. Incremental tax revenues should be net of explicit costs to host events or teams, right? So if we do actually get, he says, and this is, again, we're trying to plan our understanding, we're trying to make our decision. If we're going to get some tax revenues, whether it's hotel tax or restaurant sales tax, this is all going to the city of New Orleans, right? So we're going to get hotel tax, tax on taxi cabs, tax on, sales tax at the concession stand, sales tax on the tickets, right? So if the city is going to get all this sales tax, which is great, we still have to figure out specifically all of the costs for running these events at the Superdome, and we need to be very clear on what those costs are and balance them very clearly against that sales tax revenue. He comes right down to it, and this is in his section 5, Economic Theory for Economic Impact of Sports. He says, sports for New Orleans is a luxury, and for most cities it's a luxury. Sports is a luxury good. It is not a productive resource. Ultimately, big team sports, mega events at the Superdome may not be an economic benefit for the city. So what to do? What does he suggest? He has in his section Spectator Sport and Revitalization of New Orleans. And I'll just run through some of the issues that he brings forward. Currently, he says, 2006, in the community, in the state, in the country, there's a high perception of risk caused by the failure of the levees. If the levees failed with Katrina, and we haven't quite figured out how or why, how will we keep that from happening again? Also, there was great, as you might remember, there was great criticism about the lack of adequate response from government, whether that be city government, state government, or federal government. So if you're an investor coming into New Orleans and you want to try to help rebuild a business or you want to try to start a new business, right, do you have the confidence that the levees will hold, that we won't be going through this again next year? And do you have the confidence that if we have disaster again, that government will respond in a more timely fashion, so the city will be able to respond better? So that's one of the issues. Another issue, the devastation of the middle class and the lower class has had profound impact on sports industry for customers and for the workforce. So if you are in the sports industry and you want customers, you have lost a significant number of them, right? So if you're coming back in for sports, for the sports industry, your customer base has dwindled significantly. And you may not have a good workforce either. The destruction of the lower Ninth Ward. This was one of the largest devastated areas in New Orleans. Requires greater income to restore the area than can be earned through working sports events. He says that sports events employs people, but it underemploys them, right? It typically employs people, and if you've worked at the Intrust Arena, you know this. It typically employs people seasonally. It's typically not full-time employment, even when you're in season. There's no benefits typically, and they will pay better than minimum wage, but not a whole lot better, right? So typically it's very difficult to restore the Ninth Ward, and if you're someone who wants to be employed by the Superdome, you may not make enough money to live in New Orleans. Money spent on sports infrastructure would delay replenishment of housing, which would frustrate the financial interests of the sports establishment. So if we put money into restoring the Superdome, then that means we don't put money into restoring people's housing, which means we don't have people to come out and pay ticket fees for the Superdome, right? So he says this is kind of a circle that can't be fixed. Restoring the Superdome sends a message, and this is one of the most positive things he says, right? Restoring the Superdome sends a message that New Orleans is on the way back. Right? So the restoring the Superdome sends a message, we're on our way back. But they're very discouraged, these economists. They say, you know, you can do that, and that's good, right? Because it makes people say, ooh, New Orleans is coming back, let me have confidence, I will invest here. But if we don't follow through and restore housing, then you might have a nice Superdome, but you won't have anybody sitting in the seats. So keep that in mind. Ultimately, the economists are saying here, if we have fewer residents in New Orleans, we will have fewer fans. If we have fewer fans, we have less spending. If we have less spending, we have less tax revenue. We've got to get the population back if we're going to have a Superdome. So finally, wrapping it up, he says, can New Orleans afford sports reconstruction? Can they afford it? I keep saying he, sorry, the two of them. There's a loss of housing stock, fewer houses, the middle class is fleeing, state and local government revenue have fallen because there aren't as many people here anymore, and we're expending a lot of our money to recover from this terrible, terrible storm. The middle class has to be convinced that it's safe to return. The middle class has to be convinced that the water is safe to drink, not only for them, but for everybody. Insurance companies must be convinced. Well, insurers, insure your house. New Orleans cannot afford the reconstruction of sports facilities at the time of this writing. The Superdome gives value. The Superdome can give value, but the Saints do not give value. The Saints don't have a stake in the community. The temptation to leave after this kind of disaster to the community is great. The Superdome does serve as a symbol that the city is viable. So, what to do?